Hello, everyone. So today I'm recording a special bonus episode for Holy Week, and it is a very different kind of episode from the kind that I usually do. First, I want to say that this episode is different because I can feel like in my whole system that this is strenuous for me to record because it is activating my nervous system. In fact, I was still discerning whether or not to do this, reminding myself that I didn't have to do it, that I was free not to do it, because I could feel my nervous system going into fight or flight, right? I was hyperventilating. I could feel a bit of like acid reflux happening in my gut. I know that I'm going to feel vulnerable recording this episode, but it's a choice that I freely made. And even as I'm saying this right now, I'm reminding myself that I can stop at any time, that I can pause when I'm doing this episode, because I am as important as the people that I'm choosing to do this for. So, what's going to happen is I will be reading out loud a post, which is kind of like an open letter that I wrote during Holy Week last year. Okay, I had written this sharing on my personal blog, and it was very significant because it was basically the first time I was disclosing in any public way what I had experienced and gone through as I awakened to the reality that I suffer from spiritual trauma. So this time last year, roughly this time last year, Holy Week last year, I still did not really have the language for spiritual abuse, but I was already discovering the language for spiritual trauma, and I was able to identify the symptoms that I have been feeling, the things that I've been experiencing, right? And last year, Holy Week was the first time I felt ready and safe enough to disclose some of my experiences, and I felt called to as part of my own journey. And this disclosure, it cost a lot. It felt like it cost a lot to me because for the longest time in my life, my identity has hinged on being Catholic, and being Catholic in a very, well, uh, almost like successful way. Okay, I had no problem with practicing my faith, no problem with attending mass, with devotions, even if I wasn't very enthusiastic about some. I have no problem in the sense of, at the most, I would think it didn't connect with me. I never really experienced being triggered. I didn't have the awareness of being triggered or of really experiencing bodily suffering, okay, when it came to doing faith related things to do with my Catholic faith. And that's huge because I later went on, like part of my story was that I was working full time in a parish in evangelization, information with youth and young adults, and later adult faith formation and catechesis. In so many ways, the role self that I had developed growing up, one who is responsible, capable, and could be a role model, I lived in that space for so long. And when my interior journey of integration and healing began to deconstruct, or God began to undo these things, it was very, very painful for me, even just existentially, having to die to the self image that I had held on for so long. All right. So everyone's story is different. I know not everyone who is experiencing spiritual trauma or religious trauma will resonate with, my experience. But I believe that you will resonate with at least some parts of this experience. Okay. So I'm going to be reading this letter that I basically wrote, this open letter that I wrote last year. And it's rather long. So I gave it kind of like section headings when I was writing it. And I invite you to listen to this as, at the pace that is comfortable for you. I'm going to be pausing when I need to. When I read this, I invite you to pause when you need to, if you feel a need to, as you're listening to this. So this is basically my story. So it is very precious to me. And there are still parts of myself in my internal family system that probably feels a little afraid that we're sharing this. Last year, when I first wrote it, it was a deliberate choice to put it on my personal blog because, I think my personal blog is the readership is even lower than my usual modest audience. And it's like I wanted to be able to put it out there, but I wasn't quite ready for too many people to hear it because it didn't feel safe enough. This year, Holy Week, I feel like I want to share this, especially since my last podcast episode that I did with Paul Fahey was about spiritual abuse. I wanted to share this letter with anyone who may be struggling with Holy Week or may have noticed that you're struggling with Holy Week, but you don't completely understand why. That could be because you're at the point in your journey where you don't yet have the language for spiritual and religious trauma, but maybe you're beginning to feel the effects, the symptoms, right? Then I hope that this letter will help you, give you a bit of language to name what you're experiencing and to begin to help you to begin to maybe process what's happening. More importantly, I hope that my sharing helps you to give yourself permission to let God meet you exactly where you are this Holy Week, in spite of whatever scripts may have ruled and governed you before. Okay, so here goes. Oh, I also want to add that I will be linking to the written version of this letter in the show notes, okay, of this episode. So if you wish to, you can click on that, and you can also read. You can read along, or you can just read the written version if that works better for you. So the title of the letter is To My Fellow Complex Trauma Survivors Who Struggle with Holy Week. My dear Catholic or Christian complex trauma survivor, we're deep into Holy Week now, and perhaps you're feeling triggered and activated by the readings, liturgy, devotions, and reflections, and this makes you feel guilty and ashamed. Or perhaps you're staying away from church this week because your reactions to these triggers are too intense, and this too is filling you with guilt, and you can't help wondering, what's wrong with me? Why am I reacting this way? Why can't I just toughen up and participate and be prayerfully present to Holy Week like I want to? As a fellow complex trauma survivor who has experienced different variations of what I described above in the last 9 years of my life, I want to first assure you that you are not alone in your pain, and I get it. And I know how lonely being in this place is, and how difficult it is to find any people or resources that help us understand what is going on inside of us. Most spiritual guides, even good ones, are still unfamiliar with complex trauma and how it interacts with our faith and religious practice. And most good trauma-informed practitioners, which are already rather hard to find, are not necessarily able to relate with what our Christian or Catholic theology and spirituality means to us. While I am neither a certified spiritual director or any kind of licensed trauma practitioner, I'm a lover of Christ within the Catholic Church, who is also a recovering complex trauma survivor. So it is from my own experience that I wish to reach out to you now. And I hope that sharing my journey and what has helped me will let you feel less alone and abandoned this Holy Week. I used to numb and dissociate in order to be physically present. I have been Catholic since I was 6 years old, when my parents converted to the faith. And for the first 30 years or so of my life, I never consciously had any trouble staying through any mass, liturgy, or devotional practice, even when it was boring or when I was irritated or annoyed by the preaching. Even during the decade I lived abroad away from home in the faith community I grew up in, a decade that coincided with a period of my life when I interiorly felt the furthest away from God and the most sinful and unworthy, I never missed a single Sunday Mass or day of obligation unless I was really too sick to go. Even when I traveled in foreign countries, finding a Catholic church to attend Mass on Sunday was always a priority, even if Mass was celebrated in a language I did not understand. That was how good a Catholic I was, or at least that was how I thought of myself. Not only did I attend Mass regularly, I actively read and learned about the faith so that I could more deeply appreciate what the teachings of the Church, the sacraments, and the liturgy of the Mass was all about. In my mid-30s, which is 10 years ago now, God began to do deeper inner healing in my life. More specifically, God began to draw me into healing the affective foundations of my humanity. Before this happened, I never thought or knew that spiritual maturity or discipleship needed so much emotional healing and integration. But it became painfully clear that in order to love God and neighbor authentically, I needed to be healed in my relationship with myself. I came to realize that there has been much complex trauma in my life, in particular attachment trauma, that was heavily tinged and blended with my family's Catholic faith. Without being aware of it, I had been numbing and dissociating when any faith-based activity or event triggered my wounds. That was no different from the way I numbed or dissociated in my family or daily life when I was in a situation I could not escape. I automatically tuned out. Sometimes time passed without me even realizing, for when I'm present again, I could not recall what had been said. When this happened at Mass, I used to feel guilty because I thought it was simple distraction, or that I was just not attentive or interested or humble enough. I now know that that's a common survivor mindset, right? That's self-blame. I never realized that numbing and dissociating was what had enabled me to be physically present for so many faith-related activities that would have otherwise been emotionally stressful for me. I just want to add an aside that when physical presence and participation is not seen as something that I have a choice about, and I never did, and it's not even just for Mass, for many faith-related activities and retreats sometimes, I never gave myself that option to opt out, regardless of how safe or unsafe I felt. So it was always, I think dissociation helped me a lot to survive so that I wasn't in touch with how I actually truly felt. Okay, so the next section, waking up to anger and my body saying no. I experienced burnout and developed chronic digestive and health issues during my early 30s when I was working full-time in a parish. It was eventually these issues that led me to accept my limits and to begin to take my body's protests seriously. I had been so used to ignoring my body's signals and pushing ahead to do whatever was right. Self-abandonment was part of my distorted understanding of love and discipline, and numbing allowed me to ignore the shadow side of my psyche until old dysfunctional relational patterns reappeared and wreaked havoc in my life and my health. That was when I realized that I needed more than spiritual healing. Being aware that the dysfunctional patterns in my relationships with others and with authority were linked to my family of origin wounds, I began going for counseling to work on these issues. And as the deep affective dimension of my inner self began to feel safe to express itself to me, I began to feel, like really feel, long suppressed emotions in my body. The first of these emotions that really surfaced was anger. And sometimes the anger was so strong, I would even describe it as rage. And I did not know at first where it was coming from. It was so scary. But thankfully, I had not only a good spiritual director to talk these things through with, I also had a therapist who was trained to help me process my emotions. And my current therapist, whom I've been seeing for the past 4 years, is somatically trained and trauma informed, and that has brought a whole new dimension to my integrative, like especially like embodied healing. I began to notice around this time, this was like a few years ago now, I began to notice that I would feel angry at some masses and sometimes very angry indeed. And during Holy Week in particular, I began to notice how much I actually dissociated during the liturgy. Even when I tried to be fully present, I would dissociate again after a few minutes. Now I know that it was my body and nervous system trying to protect me. It took many months afterwards for me to learn to dialogue with my anger and with my body and to begin to understand what the anger was trying to protect me from. There were so many layers to unpack, and it took months and then years. Trauma mingled with faith. Without going into detail, I can share that over the years, I realized that particular notions and images of God and the Catholic faith have been interwoven into the intergenerational trauma that I have inherited. As I learned more about trauma and became more integrated within myself, I also began to realize how much of the liturgy, preaching, and church experiences, including confessions, retreats, and guided reflections, are also colored by distorted images of God, human dysfunction, and even systemic and historical trauma. Okay, as an aside now, this is Anne in the present time, speaking in the present time. In the years since I wrote this letter, I have also picked up language of spiritual abuse, and now I know that many of those systemic, cultural trauma, intergenerational trauma that I had begun to awaken to included spiritual abuse as well and spiritually abusive dynamics. Okay. All right, back to my letter. My distorted lens of God, faith, and church had exacerbated and compounded my familial trauma. Sin, shame, and fear, instead of a free and joyful love of God, had become the driving force behind my quest for spiritual perfection. But all of this happened in a climate of unawareness, much like it was in my own family. My body and my nervous system had protected me from being aware of much of this pain and shame without my mind ever being conscious of it, by simply numbing me or taking my attention offline when necessary. I strove for perfection and excellence as a Catholic in all the ways I knew how to, in the meantime, to keep shame at bay. But now my body was awake, and I was feeling again. I began to experience physical symptoms when I refused to listen to my body's no. I remember one particular Mass I attended when I felt angry and nauseated during the homily, and again while watching a video that was played after Mass. Both times, a part of me wanted to just run out of the church, but I was determined to stay until Mass ended. I managed to stay, but I fell sick the next day. I had entered a new phase of my healing where I could no longer dissociate, even when I wished I could. My body was speaking so loudly now, and I had to decide how to respond. Dying to ego into authentic love. Healing and interior integration is a great shaking up and shaking off. During these years, I realized how much I clung to my self-image of a disciplined, devout, well-formed, model Catholic, just as much as I clung on to my self-image of being a responsible, loving, selfless, and capable daughter, which in my family included being a good, well-formed, and knowledgeable Catholic. And God began to ask me to choose between one, accepting the truth of my reality in humility, and two, clinging on to a facade of perfection and performance to protect that image, even when it was harming my body. Only one of these can lead to more healing and integration. One led to life, and the other choice would keep me living in denial, which was no life at all. I chose truth. And choosing truth required me to leap into an abyss, a dark hole where I had to forgo the safety nets of my old understanding and certainties about right and wrong, my old certainties about what truth was. To heal and become alive in Christ, I needed to die first. Would I be willing to be that grain that falls into the earth and dies in order to bear an abundant harvest? With God's grace, I said yes. And that yes led me to enter more deeply than I ever had before into God's love and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Entering Christ's wounds through my wounds. All the theological and spiritual knowledge I had gained intellectually before was now becoming incarnated. What did it truly mean that Christ came for the lost? That he went to the marginalized, the sinners, the ones who were incapable of earning proof of their worthiness through merit, and that he loved them unconditionally. In the past, I believed all this intellectually, but I never identified myself as one of the marginalized. I always identified myself as one who was doing a pretty good job earning righteousness because I knew my faith, and I knew what I needed to do to be a good practicing Catholic, and I did that. And when I failed, I went to confession, also the right thing. But I was performing for God, for others, and even for myself. I had not yet touched the wounds of Christ because I had not entered my wounds. My resistance in accepting the truth of my inner reality, that of a gravely wounded child, rather than a mature, respectable, and sterling Catholic specimen, revealed just how much of me was still in need of being unconditionally loved and accepted. Only unconditional love of myself in the truth of my inner reality could set me free. By entering my wounds, I was finally able to enter Christ's wounds, and through his wounds, into the heart of God the Father. Why Holy Week can be re-traumatizing for trauma survivors. Among the newest explanations of trauma that I've come across are that trauma is what happens inside of us when we are left alone to deal with fear and helplessness. And that trauma is also anything that happens to us too much, too fast, and too soon. In other words, experiences that are too intense to be digested by our current capacity, especially if these experiences activate our unhealed wounds, can easily re-traumatize us. Holy Week is the most intense week of the Church's liturgical year, not only physically, because there are longer readings and longer liturgies, but also emotionally and spiritually. Think of the themes that come forth during Holy Week, what we are often viscerally made to pay attention to. Christ's betrayal and abandonment, Christ being mocked, condemned, tortured, and killed for being true to who he was, the Son of God, and for speaking truth. We also have the shame of Peter's abandonment of Christ in his time of need and Judas's despair. We observe the grief of Mother Mary as she witnessed her son's torture and death. We experience the terror of the followers of Christ who feared for their lives. Any one of these could be sufficient to activate a trauma survivor, much less all of them, in a span of an intense few days. What compounds the trauma for some of us is that we have been shamed and blamed for Christ's suffering somewhere in our religious upbringing. For example, as a young child, I was told that every time I sinned, I was nailing Jesus to the cross anew. And I was a highly sensitive child with a very vivid imagination. I don't need to explain how this image has haunted me my entire life, especially during Good Friday and during the Fridays of Lent during the Stations of the Cross. Was it surprising that I always dissociated in some way or form when I had to meditate on Christ's passion? Imagine the guilt I felt that I could not be more like the saints who frequently contemplated Christ crucified. Whenever I tried, I would feel nothing. And I would wonder what was wrong with me, that I felt no emotion for Christ's sacrifice for me. In a previous year's blog entry, I had also written a sharing titled A Good Friday Confession, I Don't Feel Anything. And I will link that post to this episode as well. Letting God love me through self-love. It has taken me quite a few years and liturgical cycles through Holy Week to simply accept the truth of how I feel during Holy Week. It has taken even more time to believe that the loving God who is healing my wounds was not demanding me to show up and suffer through Holy Week because Jesus suffered, and to fall sick just because that is what a good Catholic would do, just to prove my faithfulness to him. No, that came from an old, distorted image of God that I had somehow inherited. It is not the true God who has been revealing himself in new ways to me in my healing. Surrendering through my healing process helped me to experience that it pleases God for me, the wounded one, to be tenderly treated, ministered to, and lavishly loved according to my needs in the present moment. Experiencing this helped me to enter more deeply into Christ's life and even into his suffering and death. For by embracing my helplessness, I entered Christ's helplessness in his passion. By grieving the truth of my powerlessness, I was united in a very real way with Christ, who freely chose to be powerless. An important principle in trauma-informed care is titration, because trauma is too much, too fast, too soon. Allowing ourselves to experience things in small doses that our bodies can digest will allow us over time to heal and grow in our capacity to receive those experiences that used to traumatize us. I found that the practice of titration is a powerful form of contemplative self-love through which I can slowly become present to the events of Holy Week. This requires that I trust my body's wisdom and my own inner intuition about how much I can take, and that I honor those boundaries. Each time I could show up to protect the dignity of my wounded parts, my fragmented inner parts felt safer with me and became more integrated into my true self. In this way, healing slowly, very slowly, happened. New trauma-informed wineskins needed. I believe that the church is still maturing and evolving in consciousness, and I have hoped that someday there will be more trauma-informed theology, spirituality, pastoral care, and perhaps even trauma-informed liturgy. I think that the day these things will be normalized and commonly understood and accepted by the church and by Catholics is still very far away indeed. So unfortunately, trauma, both with a big T or a small t kind of complex trauma survivors, will continue to be among the misunderstood and under-cared for people on the margins of the church. Some of us suffer in secret while still showing up regularly in the church. Some of us are trying to find ways to titrate our encounters with church or with aspects of faith that traumatize and re-traumatize us. And some of us may have decided to just stay away from all aspects of organized religion and worship for the time being. We are at different stages of healing, different seasons of life, and different stages of our relationship with God. Many different factors contribute to our choices, and I know that it has not been easy for you, no matter how you are coping right now. What can trauma survivors do to support ourselves better in a church culture and environment that is not yet trauma aware or informed? What I can suggest based on what has helped me is this. First, pray for and seek out an experienced, attuned spiritual director who, even if not formally trauma informed, you experience felt safety with. Such a spiritual director will not hasten to judge or advise you, even if your experience is new to them. A discerning spiritual director is a good listener and will listen with openness to the Holy Spirit's prompts and how to respond to you and guide you to recognize how God is present to you in your current situation in ways that you may not expect. If you can find such a spiritual director, you are very blessed. You can share your healing and integration experiences with your spiritual director, because I have found that an open and attuned spiritual director will be eager to learn new things beyond their own training. They will not judge. They will not be too eager to impose their thoughts. They are more self-aware and more concerned with, pausing and listening to what the Holy Spirit may be prompting them to say to you. Secondly, pray for and find an attuned, trauma-informed counselor or therapist. This is different from just a therapist who does trauma work or advertises themselves as trauma-informed. Being trauma-informed and attuned is quite distinct, unfortunately, from being trained to work with trauma. How can you tell? Your body will know. Your intuition will tell you. An attuned therapist, just like an attuned spiritual director, will make you feel safe and relaxed. And you will feel seen as a person and not just as a collection of issues to be analyzed and fixed. And an attuned therapist, as well as an attuned spiritual director, if you do become activated and dysregulated, they will tend not to be defensive. They'll pick up on that and they will know how to do repair with you so that you can become regulated again, right? And feel safe again to share. So such a therapist will not rush your treatment or healing and will help you to feel a new spaciousness in your journey. If your therapist makes you feel hurried or rushed, tell them so. And if they're open and able to repair with you and adapt to your needs, that is itself a mark of an attuned therapist. And thirdly, pray for, seek, and hopefully you will find faith resources that are emotionally safe and gentle. Such resources are quite rare, especially for Holy Week, but I think some are starting to exist. What I usually do is I will search on the internet on Google, Lent, trauma-informed Holy Week. You can put in Catholic there if you're a Catholic, and take a look at what shows up and check it out and just check in with yourself as to whether it feels like it feels safe for you, whether it's something that you want to try. Okay. Final thoughts. I have been asked, and I continue to be asked, by people from different countries where they can find trauma-informed spiritual directors and therapists. And it is indeed a grace to find even just one of these. And I wish to stress this most important point, that God will and does provide, just not always in the ways that we expect. There may well be long seasons when we cannot find an appropriate spiritual director or therapist, but God may send us help in the form of someone else that enters our life, or through a book, through media. In my own journey, I've been fed in many different ways, and I've also been kept feeling hungry for long seasons too. Yet there has always been sufficient grace to keep me healing and growing, even if sometimes that season of healing growing feels like nothing is happening at all or that I'm regressing. It is all part of the journey into deeper faith, hope, and love, and this journey was never meant to be easy. I hope this very long sharing that I've written today can be one of the resources that you were surprised to discover exists. I hope that in some small way, I've made you feel less alone, lost, or confused. It has taken me a very long journey to feel at peace in sharing this much of my journey publicly. I know it will not be welcomed, understood, or approved by many of my fellow Catholics. In fact, my own younger self would not have been able to appreciate this sharing either. Not before God revealed to me my own wounds and invited me into them. I share this now because it is the right time for me in my own journey to do so. I can do so without abandoning myself. And I can do so feeling deeply and securely rooted in God's love for me. Writing this blog entry is part of my own trauma-informed Holy Week spiritual practice this year, for it has kept me in deep silence and solitude for an entire day and has helped to ground me in the Paschal mystery through my own life. I share my story in solidarity with all trauma survivors who love Christ and love the church, but who often feel unseen and unsafe in the church we love. Take courage and have hope, for our stories are not finished yet. And it is God alone, God who is love, who will see us through to the end. Journeying with you, Anne Yong. So I hope this letter, this sharing that I had written and now read aloud to you, that it helps you, that it consoles you. If you have found yourself and you find yourself maybe crying at certain parts of it, I want you to know that I have cried with you, and I'm probably going to cry after this again with you. There are many, many people who are incapable of understanding this lived experience of what we go through as trauma survivors, particularly spiritual and religious trauma survivors. But God sees us. And as we heal and as we integrate that truth that God sees us, accepts us, and loves us unconditionally, that truth slowly becomes more and more real, more and more embodied, until it is large enough for us to live in that space in spite of how many, many other people, and perhaps most of the people in our life, do not see us, do not understand us, and cannot accept what we're going through. You're not alone. You're so not alone. Let us pray for one another and for all who suffer and struggle during Holy Week because of their wounds and because of trauma, and particularly for those who have experienced spiritual abuse, whether they are aware of it or not. God be with you.